I'm curious to see if there's any chance the committee would have Ohio State ahead of either Arizona State or Baylor in this mix. Because I think when you get down to it, you can really parse the schedules and find some things that could work in Ohio State's favor. But, Ari, as we think about this Michigan State win for Ohio State, should Ohio State fans be really excited, about Ohio State getting back into this mix, or is there a lot of caution you think that there's maybe still a long way to go? How should people be expecting the Buckeyes are going to be viewed?
Well, I think that the most interesting thing and what we talked about and what I wrote about after the game is not necessarily maybe where Arizona State and Baylor are in relation because they're one-loss teams, but the thing that I would be concerned with if I were an Ohio State fan is if Ole Miss with 2 losses or there's a 2-loss team, because that would indicate there's a lack of respect.
That's a game changer.
You know, I think that you don't want to see anything. If there's a toss-up and Ohio State is on the bottom half, on the wrong side of the toss-up, I think Ohio State can live with that. If there is a situation where there's a team with 2 losses, that's an indication that Ohio State doesn't have the committee's respect, and that would be a bigger red flag. I think being number 8 with a month left in the season, we've watched college football long enough to know anything can happen. Wouldn't be a terrible place to be because there's only 3 more teams you'd have to jump to be into the top 4. So I think just being in the conversation right now is big. Ohio State still has 3 more games left. Every other team in front of them has 3 games left, plus conference championships. I think being number 8 would not be the ideal situation for Ohio State, but I think that would be a satisfying place for them to be if that's where they do land.
As a reminder, Ohio State, and again, as another reminder, polls don't matter. However, Ohio State is 7 in the coaches poll. They are 8 in the AP poll, and in our first 4 poll here, where we have 13 writers from around the country, I vote in that as well. Ohio State was 8th this morning when we released that. Everybody's pretty much in agreement. It's Mississippi State, Florida State, then you go back and forth. Is Oregon 3rd and Bama 4th or vice versa? But those are the top 4 I think that we're going to see tonight. Then everybody else has TCU 5, Baylor 6, and most of the places have Arizona State 7 and Ohio State 8. Bill, we know that there's a lot left, and there's sort of 2 things at play here. It's sort of hard to talk about and write about sometimes. It's what we think is going to happen with the committee, which is the only thing that matters. What is going to happen? But then there's the what should happen. Our opinion on, is the committee right? We're not going to pretend that we're experts like a guy like Adam Rittenberg is about every other team in the country. But the team that you saw Saturday, the Ohio State team you saw, you went back and did your TV rewatch as you do every week. That post just went up a little while ago. Watching that game again, do you think that Ohio State team can compete with the top 6, 7 teams in the country? Or do you think, from what you know, and I'm asking you not what you know, compare Ohio State to Alabama, but did that Ohio State team look like a team, in your opinion, that can play with anybody?
Yeah, it did. And I'm not, you said it, I'm not an expert. I've seen a bit of Florida State. I haven't seen Mississippi State at all, a bit of Oregon, a bit of Alabama. So I don't have a complete picture of what those teams actually look like. But from what I saw from Ohio State on Saturday night against Michigan State, was a dominant offense and a defense that gave up some yards, but ultimately was good enough to beat the number 8 team in the country on the road. And I asked Adam that question about who has the best win. And I don't know if Ohio State's win over Michigan State is the best win, but I do know that Ohio State, among all the teams in the playoff, is the only one, and correct me if I'm wrong, to go on the road and beat a top 10 team.
I think that does matter, and I think it's hard. You look at teams and you're trying to figure out what's the quality win. Well, when you beat a team, they lose. So it's like, of course, that team has a loss. I think it seems like, talking to Adam, he said, when I talked to him earlier today even, he emphasized Michigan State's still a good team.
Yeah.
Michigan State has losses to Ohio State, which certainly looks like a good team, and Oregon, which certainly looks like a good team. If Michigan State was in a different place, maybe Michigan State could be undefeated if they had a different schedule or in a different conference. I think the thing that is hard to get past for me a little bit at this point is any idea that there's a gap between, for instance, TCU and Baylor, and then you go down to Ohio State. I think that should be, a strong conversation about, where they are in that mix. And one of the things I think is interesting is a lot of times when we were watching these other Big Ten games on Saturday, Indiana, Penn State, and Michigan Northwestern set back offense 100 years. Both those games, nobody could score.
But those are football games?
You know, and people want to say, well, is that terrible offense? Is some of it good defense? You know, Alabama and LSU didn't score a lot of points in their game. Alabama found a way to win, to beat LSU. That's a tough win. They had to go to overtime in a low-scoring game. You know, TCU and Baylor, they have high-scoring games. Ohio State, Michigan State was a high-scoring, offensively fueled game. You know, we know both those teams ranked decently in defense as well, but do you think that offense, does it matter at all that Ohio State is winning not 20-10, but they're winning 49-37? Do you think that matters at all? That because you can win impressively, but it be low scoring. Does it matter if you win impressively, but it's high scoring?
I think that when you watch a football game, as the committee's supposed to be doing, you get a sense for whether it's quality football or not, regardless of...
I just took your water. That was really weird. Yeah. And you thought that was quality football?
Which game?
I
mean, I think you can tell. And what I think is interesting is that, like, there is an eye test part of this now. You know, the whole quality wins and the, bonus points or whatever, the piling it on in the past might have worked for the BCS race, but now that you have people watching it, I think they can tell the difference between Bama's win at LSU and Michigan Northwestern. Even though both were low-scoring games, one was a high-quality football game and one was a low-quality football game. I think that that's a real thing. The thing that I think Ohio State will benefit from is that they went on the road and played a team that is perceived to have one of the best defenses in the country. And I think there were some great defensive plays, but they were still able to look good. And I mean, really, they won by 12, but they did kind of blow Michigan State out at night on their home field. And I think that's a very, very impressive thing for people to consider. And if they would have won 24-10, I think that also would have been equally impressive as long as it looked good. The most interesting thing that I think Adam said when we were talking to him was that you could tell that was a good-looking football game.
Yeah.
Yes.
And because of it, regardless of whether it was high or low scoring, I think Ohio State's going to be it's going to resonate well with the committee.
I forgot to write about this at any point, but when we were riding down in the elevator at the end of that game, Jim Delaney was in the elevator with us, the Big Ten commissioner, and I said, you know, I actually said, what do you think the playoff committee is going to think of that game? And he sort of said, well, you know, I don't know. But he said it was a showcase game. That was the phrase he used. And sometimes, I mean, we knew it was going to be a showcase game, but then it was a showcase game. If that was the best that the Big Ten has to offer, you know, it was a pretty good offering. Because, you know, again, people are pointing to that TCU Baylor game this year. That was a shootout. Nobody stopped anybody in that game. So, you know, if you want to say, well, does Ohio State have some vulnerabilities on defense or anything? I mean, which is certainly something you can question. You know, there are other highly ranked teams who have vulnerabilities on defense. You thought it was a good game? Did you get that same feeling of you watched that and thought, yes, this is high quality football?
Yeah, and I think it's kind of maybe the best case scenario for the Big Ten, and I think I asked you this after the game, would have been Michigan State winning that game in terms of getting a Big Ten team in the playoff. But short of that, they needed it to be a competitive football game. They needed both teams to look really good, and I think they did. Ohio State obviously looked a little bit better, but Michigan State, I mean, Michigan State kind of shot itself in the foot. I mean, if Michigan State doesn't have a holding call that brings back a touchdown and miss a field goal, I mean, that's a closer game. I don't know, the outcome might still be the same, but it's an even better game than it was. So when I look, there's been plenty of games, even the TCU Baylor game. I don't want to sound like I'm biased toward the Big Ten because I don't think I am. But the TCU Baylor game to me when I watched it, it didn't seem like a quality football game to me. It seemed like two offenses just chucking it around and two defenses who couldn't stop anybody. And it wasn't the case of. It didn't seem like it was an overpowering offensive performance like Ohio State was against Michigan State. It seemed like just two hapless defenses.
And the thing in the Ohio State-Michigan State game was it wasn't a particularly clean football game.
No,
there were a lot of mistakes.
I mean, there were a lot of mistakes, and fumbles and turnovers and holding calls, and but still, even as that was happening, you could tell that both teams were competent. It wasn't. I think that there's a lot of times where a team will fumble the ball because they're just not a good team, and then there's other times where you might make a mistake because you're playing a quality opponent. And both made mistakes, both made big plays, both persevered through swings. I mean, you saw in the first half, maybe if that holding call doesn't happen, Michigan State blows Ohio State out. I mean, things happen in games that change momentum. But I think The thing that you take away from the game more than anything is that both teams had mistakes, both teams responded, and it turned out to be a great game. And I think those mistakes happened as a result of talent, not incompetence.
The eye test makes me nervous, but the committee has brought the eye test into the equation. They basically said they eye tested Alabama ahead of TCU last week. That puts the eye test on the table. They watch every game. We know they watch that game. I'll be curious to see if the eye test does anything. One thing I want to get to before we move on is Reese Davis is the guy who used the word on ESPN's first telecast of the playoff poll a couple weeks ago, the albatross. He said, is the Virginia Tech loss an albatross on Ohio State's neck? Here's my question, quick answer from you guys. Can they do anything to shake that, or will that albatross stay with Ohio State the whole season?
I think, and we're going to touch on Nebraska in a second, but if Ohio State runs the table, plays in the Big Ten championship game against Nebraska, and looks as good against Nebraska as it did against Michigan State, I think that helps bury that Virginia Tech loss a little more.
It's funny because Urban Meyer is so big on not using excuses. Use it! Use an excuse! That is, Ohio State wants to play that game off as an anomaly. And when I asked him after the game on Saturday if Ohio State's a playoff team, he did go back and say, well, that team is not what we are. Mm-hmm. So I think that as long as Ohio State, as Bill said, can continue to look impressive, maybe get a quality win against Nebraska, I think the more impressive they look for the longer, and the longer they look impressive, the more likely the committee will forget about it. I think obviously it's going to be an albatross. It's a terrible, terrible loss. But it's almost good that it was a terrible loss because then you can point and say, well, that was... I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, that's what I've been waiting for. And again, I think we're talking about what will, not what should. I don't know if you should get a mulligan, but I wondered if the committee, as a human group, not computers looking at things, as a human group, could you get a mulligan? The first two polls so far showed us no. That is not what they were doing. Ohio State was lower ranked than any other one-loss team, save for Duke. They got no mulligan. I'm curious to see if there's a chance that the Michigan State win for Ohio State is not just a good win, but it completely causes them to reevaluate everything they thought about Ohio State and maybe brings the mulligan back into play.
Because I do think there's a difference, because if you play a good, for instance, if we just use Michigan State as an example, had Michigan State won their only time playing a quality opponent in Oregon, they got beat by a lot. I mean, it was a close game, but... Mm-hmm. When you look at that as the committee, do you say, well, the only time they faced a good team, they didn't perform well, so that's an indication that maybe they don't stack up with the best. Whereas if you look at Ohio State, you can say, well, this, and this happened with the freshman quarterback and all this, against a bad team. It clearly isn't the team that we're evaluating now. I think almost having a loss to an opponent that's like Virginia Tech might also almost play into their favor if they get that mulligan.
I mean, it hasn't. It has not yet. That's a fact. They were 14th last week. That's a fact. It has not. Maybe it will. I'm not holding my breath on that, but I'm curious to see. And I'm curious to see if the committee, they say they start with a clean slate. I'm curious to see if they're willing to truly sort of say, this one game, we didn't just take it as one game, but we went, okay, let's look at this a whole new way. And it's not just Ohio State. They could do that with a bunch of teams.
Yeah.
I think that's the most honest way to do things. To say, listen, are we sure we were looking at things the right way before? I'll be curious to see if they do it.